Right, now that we've touched briefly on the notion of a system, I want to take a step right back out and start looking at the idea of worldview. Now, this may be something that is foreign to you, it may be something that's familiar to you, but it is fundamentally something that's very, very important when it comes to our progress through the idea of systems thinking. Let's start with The Truman Show. Everybody remembers Jim Carrey's movie The Truman Show, I imagine. And you might remember that the main character was Christoph. He was the guy that was in charge of this reality. There's one line in The Truman Show which I think very, very clearly points to the all-important aspect of worldview, and that is we accept the reality of the world with which we're presented. In other words, the picture that we have of the world is our worldview. Worldview, actually, the best word for worldview is found in German, Weltanschauung, and it's usually translated worldview. It's a conjunction of two German words. Firstly, the German word Welt, which translates as world, and Anschauung, which translates as view. However, the root of Anschauung is also the word schauen, which means to look at. So, in an interesting linguistic turn, the word Weltanschauung corresponds to both the way that we look at the world as well as the view that we have of it. Now, Tony Wallace, who's an anthropologist, has got an absolutely great definition of worldview. He says that worldview is not merely a philosophical byproduct of each culture like a shadow, but, and this is the part I like, the very skeleton of concrete cognitive assumptions on which the flesh of customary behavior is hung, and importantly notes that it is implicit in almost every act. So a worldview is deeply essential to being a human. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist, says that the conception we form of the world is our picture of what we call world, and it is in accordance with this, the picture, that we orient ourselves and adapt to reality. He also comments that the basic error of every Weltanschauung is its remarkable tendency to pretend to be the truth of things themselves, whereas actually it's only a name which we give to the things. It's important to distinguish between the two. Now, obviously, there have been worldviews throughout history, and for the vast majority of human history, the indigenous worldview, in its variated forms, has predominated. The development of the agrarian era around about 2,000 years ago saw an emergence of an agrarian worldview. The industrial worldview that's preceded the one that we currently have is relatively late, and of course the knowledge worldview that we might have at the moment sits right at the very end. So in the scheme of things, the worldview that we have, which we call the Western worldview, is actually something that is quite new. In terms of human history, it's just a blip on the horizon. Now, how might we look at worldviews? Well, there are probably a couple of different ways, but the way that I choose to look at them is that there are two axes. One is the way that we adapt to the environment, and the one is the way we organise on either a collectivist or individualistic perspective. So, for example, indigenous worldviews on this matrix would be very clearly collectivist in nature and primarily a view that says to adapt the environment rather than to control it. The emergence of the agrarian worldview was nonetheless still collectivist, but it involved a change in orientation to the environment of one of control. The industrial worldview that emerged after the industrial worldview was clearly a worldview that was predicated on controlling the environment, but it also saw a shift in worldview to a far more individualistic one. Now, the knowledge worldview that we currently have is probably still individualistic, but I think that the events that are surrounding our understanding or increasing appreciation of climate change are helping us understand that we need to work with the environment and we need to be more adaptive towards the environment. And I would hope that over time, perhaps, we might even be able to extend it into a more collectivist appreciation of the world that we live in. So the worldview that we've got has actually developed over time. And Fritjof Capra, who's a systems thinker in the United States, provides us with a great little overview. He basically says that our Western worldview goes all the way back to classical Greece. Now, this is a very, very, very superficial and quick overview of the development of the Western worldview. But classical Greece gave us this split between the phenomenal and the noumenal world. The classical Greek worldview gave us the idea that the cosmos was ordered, that rational analysis was not only possible but actually desirable, that there was an inherent purposiveness in nature, and that intellectual analysis of the world was actually something that satisfied and nourished the whole. During the Middle Ages, monotheism replaced the pantheistic attitude of classic Greece. A hierarchical structure of society emerged. Time started to become understood linearly as a progression towards eternal life and the afterlife. The church became the final authority in respect to the meaning of life, and faith became more important than reason, which had been established in classical Greece. However, during the period of the Industrial Revolution that was preceded by the Renaissance, there was a revival in the notion of understanding through reason as opposed to faith. Similarly, analysis that has inevitably led to our reductionism emerged during this particular point in time, primarily as the rise of science, which became the dominant authority and replaced the authority of the church. With that reductionist analytical approach, cause and effect became understood in a linear way. And that's probably where we would see the rise of a sort of a secular mechanistic empiricism. However, in the middle of the 20th century, we might actually say that there was a bit of an eclipse of classical physics because quantum physics started to change some of the fundamental understandings or some of the fundamental elements or platforms in our Western worldview, insofar as we became aware of the fact that observers were actually participants. And Heisenberg's uncertainty principle talks about this. So that started to challenge our idea of objectivity. Indeterminism and states of indeterminate indeterminate states challenged notions of determinism. We started to appreciate through the idea of non-locality, whereby an effect could be manifest phenomenally in an environment that was not connected, starts to challenge our notion of linear cause and effect. Emergence was also something that also challenged the idea of cause and effect. And the idea of quantum entanglement defied the reductionist notion or the discretization that occurred during the Industrial Revolution. And then on top of that, what we might say the rise of the social sciences started to bring about an awareness of intersubjectivity as opposed to the subject-object dualism that we'd inherited all the way back from Greece. Our objective view of the world was gradually replaced through appreciation of perspectivism and relativism. Consequently, meaning became something that was constructed rather than something that was implicit. Interdisciplinarity and then ultimately transdisciplinarity has emerged as a reaction to the specialization that developed during the Industrial Revolution. And fundamentally and most importantly, the social sciences have given us a greater and a deeper understanding of the role of power in human relations. So where are we with our worldview? Well, I think we're at a situation where we're in crisis. The way that we think about the world is probably in many ways inappropriate to or not fit for the world in which we live, because it certainly seems to be inadequate to face many of the problems that we face. So we've defaulted to this reductionist, mechanistic, event-based linear cause and effect model. That is characterized by a tendency to generalize from the particular. It's difficult to deal with subjective factors. It tends towards simplism and obviously the notion of parsimony. It wants to break things down into smaller parts so that we can understand them. What that does is that disrupts the pattern of emergence. We tend to draw our understanding of things from the parts and not the whole. We've got this desire to want to eliminate uncertainty, and we want to avoid ambiguity at all costs. This is where systems thinking comes in to remediate. Charles Handy, the author, says that reduction is the sin of modern life, reducing things to their component parts and thereby too often missing the meaning of the message of the forest in our minute examination of its trees. So we have actually a problem. Let's have a look at the indigenous worldview, which has prevailed throughout the majority of human history. What we know in the indigenous worldview is that the world exists as one reality composed of a weave of secular and sacred dimensions, and it's in that time is not considered linearly. The past and the future coexist in the present. We can then see that around that is the individual. The individual is composed of physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual elements. Knowledge can be accessed, importantly, through each of those modalities. Consequently, actions must be guided by a number of principles that include relationship, respect, responsibility, and reciprocity. And then finally, knowledge can be transmitted through oral tradition, through experiential learning, through subjective experience and collective knowing. So consequently, what we can actually see in the indigenous worldview, from which the agrarian and subsequently the industrial worldview developed, are many principles that are enshrined in our understanding of systems thinking.